Good morning. Thanks, Colleen. Thanks, everybody, so much for joining us today. So I'm here at the University of Saskatchewan on Treaty 6 and the homeland of the Métis. It's very snowy, it's very cold, but it is very pretty. And I'm very happy to have you all here with us today for this topic. And we've got some super interesting speakers lined up. And so what we're going to do today is I'm actually going to start and give you just sort of a really brief overview for like some context and some definitions. And then we'll have presentations from each of our speakers, and I'll sort of help keep us all on track through that. And then we'll have some more discussion time later. And there is a shared document that was shared before the event as well with some questions. There have been a few questions added. Feel free to add more or add them in the chat. I'll keep an eye mostly on the chat, and we have a couple other repository folks keeping an eye on the shared document. And feel free to add resources or comments there, like it's meant to sort of live on beyond this event. So you can use it as you see fit. So I'm actually going to share like 6 slides real quick just to start us off with some context, and then I will hand it over to our first presenter. So let me see if I can make this happen right now. Okay. Does it look like I'm sharing a slideshow? Yes? Okay, cool. Thank you, everybody. I did one the other week where I got like 14 slides in before someone was like, I can't see anything. So I'm just double checking. Okay, so today's topic, going to the source, contributing to a healthy open infrastructure via free and open source software projects. So open infrastructure for open access is sort of one of these concepts. It means that not only are the sort of end products of research openly available, but there's sort of totally open infrastructure on which to share them. And this is a recurring theme in international advocacy. We didn't make this up. UNESCO talks about it in the open science recommendations. Council of the European Union's been talking about it. Of course, COAR's been talking about it. So this is something that's in the air, it's in the water. But what exactly is free and open source software? It has a long history. There's a lot of different definitions and confusion swimming around. The critters you see here are some mascots of some older free and open source software projects. I mostly just think they're cute. But I wanted to just sort of go through like a definition of software freedom for you all. So this definition comes from the Software Freedom Conservancy. It has a lot in common with the Open Source Institute definition, but it has sort of a useful emphasis on bigger picture rights for the context that we're talking about here. And so software freedom is the freedom of a user to run, study, distribute, and redistribute, install, and reinstall potentially modified versions of a piece of software. More generally, it is the idea that we are entitled to rights when using software, and there should be equal protections for privacy and redistribution. The rights should treat everyone equally, big businesses and individual consumers and users alike. And so we see this come up in things like reproducibility for research and right to repair and transparency and these sorts of things. And the history is complicated. We won't get into it, but software wasn't even copyrightable until 1980. Sorry. So there's sort of some interesting history there in terms of all the different models involved. And we're also sort of familiar with some of the consequences of depending on commercial third-party platforms, right? Copyright takedowns on YouTube or other automated content takedowns. A lot of the time they just take it down first and you can sort of challenge it later. And it might mean that older presentations and things that are up get taken down without people even noticing until it's really too late to fix it. We have stuff like with GitHub in Iran a little while ago where full services weren't available to people in Iran because of GitHub's relationship with the US government and sanctions there. Or even things like a conference I worked on back in 2020, we were putting presentations up on YouTube and also had to put them on Bilibili because people in China couldn't access things on YouTube. Just in general, being bound by terms of service and overarching goals that are not the same as our own. And the last little thing I want to bring up for some context for you, this comes up a lot in my experience when talking to people about open source at institutions. This sort of idea, even though the software license is free, isn't open source more expensive because of the labor involved? And this is a concept, total cost of ownership, and it's sort of an old concept in business. Basically, the answer is it depends. Total cost of ownership is hard to measure and has been used to argue for both sides. But it is worth noting that historically, Microsoft really embraced this idea to argue strategically against the idea of open source platforms. That article link there goes into it a little bit more. So I think it's just worth bearing in mind if you hear people repeating this, if you find yourself repeating it, that it varies a lot from situation to situation, and whose company are you in repeating these ideas? A few other technical details. So I will drop these links in the actual chat later, but we have a feedback survey, of course, as usual for this event. The paper pledge with COAR and Creative Commons and EIFL, tracking down all these climate change papers and making them open access is ongoing. We're helping coordinate that. There's a repository mentorship program coming up. Please stay tuned. And of course, as always, join the scholarly communications matter most. Okay, with that, I will stop sharing my slides. And so today, Pierre Lazou is going to start off from the Université de Laval, and then we have Kimberly Chapman from the University of Arizona, then Erica Johns and Colin Lukens from Harvard, and then Mark Jordan from SFU. So without further ado, Pierre, would you like to take it away?
Yes, thanks, Emily. Okay, let's start here. Share. Can you see my screen? Should be a PowerPoint.
Yep, you're good.
Excellent. So yeah, hi everyone. My idea today was just to share experience on the recent work I've been doing to translate DSpace and to add some documentation to it, which are two interesting things to do, but quite complicated. Before I start on introduction, I make this graph just to explain that in open source, there's also the capacity we want to bring to the software. So this is a pragmatic, I call it pragmatic circles, but let's say the further you are from the core, the less energy you may contribute, and the further you go to the core, the more energy you would have to put in to make it, to make the software nurture, let's say. So for today, here is where I locate contributing with translation, documentation, and bug reports. I will not talk about bug reports, mainly about translation and a few considerations around documentation, specifically in DSpace. I'm not talking of open source in general here. So let's start. For the translation in DSpace, so all occurs in GitHub. You have languages that are managed using JSON5 files. And one thing that may be complicated is that it follows, given that it's on GitHub, it follows the same code process, the same process as the code. So when you're editing file names, you go through the unit test workflow and then the review workflow before your contribution can go in. So you have to find someone to review. You cannot be the reviewer, both the contributor and the reviewer. So this is something to consider. There's no obligation when contributing code to DSpace to add non-English labels. So that's all the more important for, let's say, other language than English together, maybe around those files to try to translate them. Just to give you a recent example, which was where on which I've worked for the past few weeks. From DSpace 7 to DSpace 8, there was many new many components that were added. Let's say the ORCID module, it was in DSpace 7, but not translated yet. The COAR notify protocol, the subscriptions feature, all those features represent more than 1,000 new tags that were not translated in French. So when you look at the French interface, you have a lot of codes appearing because you don't have those things. So the process is very easy. I just wanted to share you this. You create a ticket. I created a ticket to say, okay, hello, I'm working on this one, on the translation for this. The idea of the ticket is basically this. You're mentioning that there's something missing, and you can claim that you want to work on it. The idea is to say to others that you're doing so to avoid, let's say, conflict if other people work on the same file as you. It can be complicated with the way DSpace is handling translations. My working environment, I'm on Windows. I started translation using GitHub, but I must say it's a bad idea because you cannot save what you're doing. So you need to make all the translation and then make a pull request or a contribution right away. So there's ways to work locally more efficiently. That's why, let's say, you fork the repositories where the files you want to edit is. Then you create a specific branch. I create a specific branch for translations. And then I work with, on my local computer with GitHub Desktop. And you need to find an editor to edit the files and make the commit then push back to the community. A few thoughts around things that can be improved. So first thing first, there's no dedicated group for French translations, so it voluntary works. You jump in, you translate if you want, but there's no coordinated activities around this, except among my immediate network. Let's say I've already worked with Caroline here, with Marie-Hélène, I think she's on the call, and other colleagues from Quebec, but it's not organized. It's voluntary work. One of the things, it's difficult to know what has changed in the files, but there's Python scripts around, and Caroline has one that can be used to compare the two, let's say the English tags and the French file, and you get an overview of what is missing. So this is a gold when your plan to work on translation. So yeah, maybe interesting to organize things for French translation, and it may be others. I don't know if other groups are already organized around this, but I think for French translation in Canada, it could be great. Let's say you can make rules for the choice of word you're making. Do you translate everything, or do you keep some word in English because they're more understandable this way? So yeah, define some common rules to work on. One limit of DSpace I found working on this, you work in one file, which is a huge file. There's more than 3,000 parameters in the file currently, and they keep adding at every version of the software. So it's quite huge to work with. There's no FRCA file, so currently it's only one file for French. There's not a lot of francophone working with DSpace and contributing back. So let's say that's not a problem, but with those specific files, like other open source software as one, like OGS, for example, as an FRCA rather than FR only, it helps because sometimes words are not the same. Just to give you an example for repositories in Quebec or in Canada, we call them dépôt institutionnel. In French, it's a whole other words called archive ouverte. So yeah, it can lead to edit war on French. Yeah, so maybe why not creating a group to improve translation in French and suggest improvement and coordinate activities? Maybe it could be a good idea. Do I have a few minutes left, Emily?
You're pretty close to your time.
Okay. Okay, because to end, the other things I wanted to share was which is another activities that needs effort if we speak about DSpace, which is all that connects with documentation. There's a lot of things to do, a lot of things to improve, and the first thing I start to do was to work on something called pull request, testing pull request, which is part of the workflows of contributing code to DSpace. The idea is the testing, the review is for developers, but the testing of the feature can be done by users. So basically, so the idea was to help people setting up a virtual environment where you can test new codes and this way tell to developers, I've taken this code, it's working, it's fine, and them can focus on more on the scripts and the code line. Yeah, a few thought about this. My contribution was a spontaneous initiatives, and there's no process for editing this documentation. When you get an account, you basically you can delete, change, do everything you want. I believe there's some moderation behind the scenes, but basically it's an account that allow you to edit every page of the documentation. But the way I work for this testing, I create a personal page, and then I validate with Tim Donioyu, the lead developer, and Olger, the DSpace coordinator, just to say, okay, what I'm saying in this page, is it good, is it not good, and where can I put it in the wiki page, just for people to share with people. So that was basically the process to add to this documentation in DSpace. Just to close, I mentioned that DCAT is currently recruiting for the documentation effort. There's 3 groups that we're creating: the introduction to DSpace, the task-oriented documentation, and the advanced configuration. The 3 themes were discussed during DCAT meetings and prioritized this way. So yeah, if you want to get involved, there's place, and there, as I said, there's work to be done around this. And thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Pierre. That's great. Thank you. We will go on to Kimberly now, if you want to share, Kimberly, and then we'll have time for more chatting later. Thanks, Pierre.
All right. Okay, I'm hoping everybody can see my screen.
Yep.
Yes, okay, great. So thanks for inviting me to today's event. I'm going to talk about how I found community in DSpace. A little play on words for those of you who are DSpace users and know that it's set up in hierarchical structure of communities, sub-communities, collections. So I'm Kimberly Chapman. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Institutional Repository Manager at the University of Arizona Libraries. And I'm coming to you today in my role as the chair of the DSpace Community Advisory Team, DCAT. Whoops. Uh-oh. Okay. So that's our repository. We're still on, we're currently migrating to DSpace 7. This is DSpace 5. So soon we will be migrated. And the University of Arizona, it is going to be 78 degrees today, but we do have snow in the mountains. And so I envy all of you are having beautiful snow right now. We're seeing that. The University of Arizona is in Tucson, Arizona, and we do respectfully acknowledge that the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. And Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, and Tucson is home to the Tohono O'odham and the Yaqui. So the DSpace Community Advisory Team, Pierre described it a little bit in his presentation. And I became involved a few years ago by participating in monthly meetings and then participating in the DSpace 7 testathon that was several years ago. And basically for those of you, and I think several different repository communities have their own user groups. But at DSpace, we have different user groups. We have the committers, the developers, and then we have our service providers. We have a governance structure. And the DSpace Community Advisory Team represents the interests of repository managers. And one of the things I love about DSpace is its global user base. And so getting to engage with repository managers from across the globe. We are in DCAT a permanent working group of DSpace governance. And the DCAT chair has a seat on DSpace leadership. It's a non-voting seat, but I get to hear the conversations and advocate for DCAT interests that come forward through that route. We have monthly calls where we share information and learn from each other. They're the second Tuesday of each month at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And we do have often a representative from a registered service provider might attend, but primarily attendees are repository personnel that are representing their communities. We do have responsibilities in DCAT to manage the testathons before each new DSpace release. So DSpace 9 is scheduled to come out, I believe, in May. We'll then probably the schedule is still being fine-tuned, but we'll be doing a testathon in April. And we also do write or approve, edit, etc., provide non-technical documentation. So the documentation that's intended for us as repository managers. We gather feedback, report bugs, and develop projects to support the community. We do have we send out notifications of our meetings to both the general DSpace community list, but we also have a more specific DSpace community advisory team Google group. And if you aren't on that list and would like to be, you might need to be logged into the Google groups first to see it, but it is the URL is on the slide. And I can put it in the chat after I'm done speaking. We have a user experience working group, and Colin and Erica are going to talk about that next. So I'm going to buzz right past that slide. And Pierre has alluded to in his slide the documentation working groups that we're currently running. I do want to say that Pierre will be running the advanced configuration options working group that is developing documentation around functions and features where developer IT support is required. And it will also really help with repository managers with knowing that what they can ask for and how to ask for that and ask what your developer needs to do. We have an introduction to DSpace working group that'll be starting up in a few weeks, which will be more of an orientation to DSpace. And currently we have a task-oriented documentation working group. We're currently reviewing documents provided by a service provider and providing edits and some other contextual information. And then we'll be sending out calls and creating new documentation to help fill in gaps. We will also be starting a feature request working group so that DCAT can have more of a voice in identifying common needs and amplifying requests that would benefit repository managers and end users more widely. And reducing barriers that people might find in terms of how to submit a feature request, because the process seems to be kind of opaque to most people, and we want to help improve that process. So thinking about open source, so what I find really interesting about DSpace, and it took me a few years. We launched our repository in 2010. I mean, that's when I became a repository manager, but it took me a few years to get involved and actually find a community. And I think so I'm not a developer. I can't contribute code. Our repository is hosted by a service provider. We don't have any local IT. And understanding when I was talking about open source to people, people often think of the developer role, and you must be a programmer, and you must be writing code, etc. But actually, open source is a whole community. And while developing that software and maintaining it and improving it is critical, the end users using the software, such as us repository managers, are also a critical component of the open source community. And so how I found community in working with DCAT, we're learning in DCAT, we're sharing. It's a way to learn best practices and develop best practices. Many of us, if we're working in repositories, are possibly the only person working in that area at our institution. And this is a way to build a network of colleagues. Also in DCAT, we really have a real potential to advocate for improvements to the software. And I myself have found this is actually a place where I feel that I belong and I can contribute in a valuable way to the open source DSpace community.
Thanks, Kimberly. That was great. It's great to hear about different ways of being involved in all of this. So with that, I want to hand it off to Erica and Colin for the next part about UX testing. Thank you.
I'm going to share my screen and then Erica's going to begin. Oop, I have to go back. Sorry. There we go.
Thanks, Colin. Hi, I'm Erica Johns. I am the repository manager at Cornell University. And I wanted to thank Kimberly for that great synopsis of DCAT. It allowed us to cut some of our slides, so thank you. Yes, so Colin and I co-chair a DCAT working group for user testing. And this started after most of us migrated over to DSpace 7. We started both individually as repository managers within the DCAT community and through feedback with our DSpace administrators locally and our own patrons and users, getting feedback about how the new platform was working. And based on that, we realized that it might be a good idea to do some user testing. And what we knew is that we had bug testing as a feature within the DCAT community, and that was a level of support that the DCAT community was providing DSpace developers already. But it didn't seem like there was something formalized for user experience. And so after conversations within the DCAT community, Colin and I got together and proposed this working group, and then solicited volunteers from the DCAT community. And from that, we came up with this charge, which was to do a lightweight user experience study. And what we hope to do is conduct this study and then provide recommendations to the development group for improvements for DSpace 8 and beyond. It'll likely be DSpace 9 and beyond at this point. And so we were able to collaborate with a number of user experience teams across different institutions. And here you'll see, so we've got Colin and I from Cornell and Harvard. We've got Jenny Yon from York University and Shannon Kippett-Smith from Rice. And then from there, we tried to find participants for the working group that had UX support locally at their institution. And then we actually reached out to a few universities that we knew, were DSpace shops that also had UX support within their libraries usually. And so from that, we were also able to get support and contributions from Duke as well. So that's our team. And then the basic, Colin will go into the methods of how we've run this study, but the scope of it was for us we essentially looked into what we thought were some of the key areas that we needed to review. So that was how search works. And that was both, the basic search, but then also how you search within communities and collections. We wanted to think about filters and subject-based searching. And then we wanted to consider the entity structure of DSpace, and then also how statistics work, what they provide, and whether or not that was comprehensive or useful for the users. So those are just some examples of what we wanted to test. And that might be the end of and then from there, this is kind of the planned deliverables that we have. We're pretty far into the process at this point. So next, we will get a report from the UX team. This will include the raw data and a summary of recommendations that they have going forward. From that, we, as the working group, will provide a recommendation report for the DCAT community, or for the DCAT community to review. And then ideally, that might be massaged or edited in some way, and then that will go to DSpace governance. From there, we're also putting together a proposal for open repositories in Chicago in 2025 on this effort. And then we hope to actually write a paper about this as well, because it seems that from what we understand, this is a somewhat novel concept of collaborating on an open source platform and doing a UX study on it. So let us know if it's not novel. That might be the end of my part. And
Okay, shifting to me. Okay. Yeah, so I'll just quickly go over the methods just that we've adopted for this project, and then it informs kind of the next slide, which talks a little bit about our lessons learned. So how did we come up with themes? Basically, what data were we looking for? It was kind of a mix of anecdotal data that we had from DCAT meetings and hearing from, this community. And we also, the folks that are part of the project actually put their heads together and said, what bothers us about these versions of DSpace that we can, maybe address. And then we also had some user feedback from actual users who did user testing locally on local configurations. So we kind of merge those into our general data pool. We did some recruitment then for this. Initially, we were going to leverage repositories running DSpace version 7. And then we found out that was actually quite complex. And then it complicated some of the UX processes that our collaborators were involved in. So we actually kind of abandoned that. So that was the lesson learned. It's like, take your failures and learn from them. So we actually spent a lot of time kind of reaching out to folks, and only to then turn around and say, "Oops, sorry, we're actually going to go a different route." So this third bullet, the testing IR, we actually decided to use the demo DSpace site. And so that we had to work with Lyrasis to basically get the testing assets in and then make them static, because that site resets fairly often if some of you have ever worked in there. So we needed to create a consistent community and collections for these testers to have there for many months. So again, that was a collaboration with Lyrasis, and we thank them for that. And then, of course, just the actual UX testing itself. So the UX collaborators we work with looked at the data points and did actually all the scripting for the test for us. And then their focus groups were actually using their own methods and recruitment within the institutions themselves. So we didn't set those parameters; those were provided for us. We leveraged the experts in those collaborative spaces. And then again, to Erica's point, they'll basically jam all the information and provide us with a report at the end, which we can absorb. So lessons so far, this is always the fun part. So the first, again, to our theme today is the open source tech stack. That was the key to this project's success. Because everything is open, there was no issues with who can do what, where can we go, what can we do. So again, like if DSpace wasn't open source, this just wouldn't have been possible. Many of you that have run projects probably always run into scope creep. So of course, that was our big problem. We wanted to test everything in DSpace, and we just couldn't do that. So we focused on what we could manage in a kind of a pilot or a first round. We also, one of the lessons we learned was a more diverse volunteer testing group. That's something we should have probably considered at first. And so that will inform future testing. It's like go out and get as many different folks, including speaking to you folks. So, next time we do this, then we can bring in these other kind of user groups and other communities. The big advantage with the collaborating with non-IR folks is it did bring some of that diversity and a separate set of eyes. So that was important. We'll definitely try to continue that sort of arrangement. I like this idea of community building as a natural byproduct. So of course we went into this trying to improve a service and a tool. And what we ended up having as a byproduct was this build of community, not only within the working group itself, but then within DCAT, and then of course speaking to you all and growing this. And so this is a really nice thing to have happen. And then of course transparency, especially with an open source community. We just have to put everything out in the open. We've done so, but it's never enough. And so that's something that we'll definitely continue to emphasize going forward. Here's our contact if you have other questions outside of today. Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much, Erica and Colin. That's great. I'm going to move on now to Mark Jordan from SFU, if you're ready to go.
Thanks. I don't have any slides to share with you.
That's great. No problem.
So you just have to stare at my face while I'm talking. I am joining you today from Simon Fraser University's Burnaby campus, which is called in Squamish language Luk-Luk-Lewaitin. And it is the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam nations. I'm privileged to live, work, and learn on these territories. So I'm on the agenda to talk about PKP and Islandora. So two different open source projects. First, I'm going to spend some time on PKP, less time, then more time on Islandora, because I've been much more engaged in a variety of roles in the Islandora community than in the PKP community. But my relationship to PKP and my involvement with it over the years. So just a little bit of historical background. PKP came to SFU Library in the very early 2000s. As part of the then library leadership's commitment to open infrastructure and open access. And PKP was part of the SFU library, actually situated in the library administratively, and in some cases office space for a number of years. And up until about 2 years ago. That's been the case up until about 2 years ago, at which point we worked to move PKP from a project of the SFU library to a more stable and structured part of the university called the COAR Facilities Program. And we did that because we felt that, and this is, when I say we, I mean all parties involved, the library, PKP, and the VP Research and Innovation, who at the time was called VP Research and International. That the COAR Facilities Program falls in that person's portfolio. A couple of reasons. One was that PKP, we felt in a way that the library, I won't say was holding back PKP, but we felt like PKP couldn't, as an organization, both producing and supporting open source software, running a fairly high volume commercial hosting service for journals, and also a research-based organization doing primary research in open access and scholarly communications, and getting grants to support that. It felt like it just needed a little bit more breathing space and a little bit more different kinds of support to thrive beyond what the library could provide to it. On the other hand, or on the other side of that kind of equation, the VP Research and Innovation wanted to diversify the core facilities portfolio, which up until that point had been pretty much all STEM oriented, kind of like laboratory oriented facilities. So it was win-win-win in that sense. My personal involvement, and I'm very proud to say that PKP is thriving. Like that vision has been fulfilled. It is thriving much more and bigger now than it ever did under the library when it was part of the library. So that all worked out. My personal involvement with PKP over the years has been fairly diverse and waning in and out. Early on in my career here as a systems librarian and in the early days of PKP, we developed something called the PKP metadata harvester, which I'm sure many of you have never even heard of. It was a way to, it was a kind of a, consider like a WordPress for OAI aggregation. So you could basically install this piece of software as a web-based piece of software, configure a bunch of OAI PMH endpoints out there in the world, and it would bring in the metadata for those and put it into one searchable website, one searchable database. And there were some interesting kind of normalization rules, and many of you, like I'm looking at Pierre in particular, but many of you who've dealt with OAI PMH over the years have known that, or seen that it's kind of useless, to be honest, unless you have some consistency in the metadata values that you're harvesting. If you don't have consistency across those values, across those data elements, it doesn't really amount to much useful. So one of the innovative aspects of the PKP metadata harvester, and this is where my metadata geek shined through a little bit, was to enable normalization of incoming OAI PMH values to a standard or standard norm, and thereby allowing individual repositories to do their own thing as far as metadata goes. But once it gets inside the metadata harvester, or in the process of getting inside the metadata harvester, it was much more consistent than it was if it was just raw coming from the various endpoints. So that was my really only deep development kind of style involvement with PKP until many years later. We and this is not truly open source, even though the components are all open source and on GitHub, but we only implemented it in one place, and that is in PKP, and that was the PKP Preservation Network, which automated getting archival information submission packages from journals into a Lockspace network. So that was another fairly intense period of development, and development not just in software, but also development in terms of a service, a global service that we could offer OJS journals around the globe. At that point, I shifted roles at SFU. I was no longer a division head who had the luxury of being kind of a developer when it suited me, to an administrator. I'm an associate dean now, and I couldn't do any of that stuff. So that was fine because I was no longer involved with the development aspects of all that, especially the PKP preservation network. But then I was able to help advocate for it and look at it from more of an organizational sustainability perspective, which is a really interesting aspect of open source. I hope that I haven't burned up many of my minutes on PKP because I do want to get to Islandora, and I'll try to keep it briefer. Within Islandora, I've been everything from a developer to the chair of the Islandora Foundation Board of Directors, and I was in the latter role for about 7 or 8 years. Witnessed and helped shepherd quite a bit of change in the community, particularly the very, very painful shift from Islandora 7 to Islandora 2, and the migrations between like to Islandora 2 by implementers in the community. And I think if I had to draw one thread to pull these two sets of activity together, it is that I'm just harkening back to Pierre's, set of concentric circles where the developer was in the middle and it kind of went out. I would posit or offer a kind of a different version of that, no more or less valid than Pierre's, but just a different version. And that is governance and sustainability could be at the core of that, and everything else kind of revolves around it. Because if you look at DSpace or PK or OJS, for example, or any of the other softwares that come out of PKP or Islandora, they are all the aggregation and result of a lot of individual developers and individual institutions implementing these things. The software doesn't just grow on its own. It just doesn't happen. It's not organic. It shouldn't be organic. It should be planned. Although sometimes we are lucky in that it does be organic. It does work that way, but that's luck, not strategy, or planning, or sustainability planning, or succession planning, and all those things. So I think governance of the various, not just the software and how it gets built and maintained and developed and grown, but also governance of the communities around the software is extremely important. Is an extremely important aspect of both of those parts of open source. And I'll close by saying that my involvement with open source now, today, is to be able to allow my institution some agency in how that software is developed and how it is used. It's not altruistic really at all. It's all about what we can get out of it. The altruistic part of it is, though, what we can get out of it should not ever be only for us. It should be something else that at least one other implementer can use and can use to great effect. So in other words, we do things here at SFU not primarily because we need them done, but we don't do them with blinders on. We do them with an eye to how another or multiple other institutions can use the tools that we develop and the kinds of sustainability that we build into the products that we use.
Thank you, Mark. That's great. And yes, I think that the ability to share and reuse work is a huge part of why this is so important for this kind of thing. So before we stop the recording, I wanted to give all our presenters a chance to sort of address one more question. So this time, like up to 2 minutes, say. So basically sharing like either a challenge people might expect to face or a tip you have if people are kind of interested in getting involved in some way in any one of these sort of circles or different capacities. So either or both, but about 2 minutes, and we'll just go in the same order if that's okay. So Pierre, do you want to take that away?
Yeah. I would say if you want to get involved and in a community, let's say you need to be humble. I don't know, humble en français. Humble. Okay, that's it. Because there's things to learn. There's a culture around this community. So you can just arrive and say, okay, I have good stuff. My stuff are good. I just go there. I say that because it's an error we made from the past. And the first thing with the local development we were doing, we thought it was gold for everyone. That's not the case. So you need to be humble and you need to observe. Écouter, I don't know, listen to the community, listen how it's structured, where the decision flow comes from, and it takes a lot of weeks, if not months, before you will be comfortable with it. But that's something that is necessary if you want to be efficient when joining a community. Yeah.
Really
It's not a question, it's a comment. It's just a comment. I don't know if you were expecting questions, Emily. It's just a comment.
No, that's perfect. This is really just, they're looking out really to others who would want to maybe go down this path. What sorts of things would you want them to know? So that's a great one for sure. And yeah, and sometimes it's nice if an open source community is doing it right. Sometimes it's easier to spy on them than otherwise and sort of get a sense of like what's going on, what the culture is, where the conversations are happening for sure. Kimberly, did you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Pierre is saying. I think in the context of getting involved in the DSpace community, it's large and complex. I started getting involved a few years ago. I did serve on DSpace leadership actually as a representative, elected representative in my institution's category at one time period, and I am still figuring out the ins and outs of how DSpace governance works. It's very complex. And Pierre had pointed out the DSpace wiki that's hosted by Lyrasis, which is the organizational home for DSpace. And navigating that wiki can be very complex. I noticed a page that described working groups that didn't have DCAT on it at all. And I'm going to jump in and fix that. So I think being patient, part of being part of the community is we are all contributing time. None of us are paid for this effort. So, and many different people with many different viewpoints are contributing at different points in time. And so I think, I very early on felt like I did not know anything at all. And then it turned out that I did have and brought more knowledge than I realized. And I think just being comfortable with listening and asking questions, because everybody's coming in from a different starting point, and being confident that we all have contributions to make, but also feeling open to hearing other ideas and being willing to ask questions, because it's all a work in progress. So, and we've kind of got to the point in DCAT where, we're looking for having something. Things don't have to be perfect. We just want to at least have something, right? And then people can improve, for example, documentation, but it'd be better to have documentation that maybe it's a little rough, but that's better than nothing. And so those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Kimberly. That's great. Erica and Colin, you can both have a one if you want. I know you're individuals, so I don't know if one of you wants to go first, or you can contribute on behalf of each other, whatever.
Thanks.
Cool.
So I think similarly to Kimberly, I've been involved in DSpace governance for a few years, and still things remain fairly opaque for me. In fact, I'm actually even helping to write the bylaws, and it's still a little opaque. So it is quite complicated. There's a lot of institutional knowledge there, and I would say that the one thing that's taken me quite a long time to understand is that there really isn't a DSpace developer that you can say, hey, we want these features, develop them for us. And they're going to do that. And it's not because there's not an interest in doing so. It's because there is not somebody who is paid by the community to develop for the community. There is a lead developer who coordinates all the development of all of the service providers associated with DSpace, who are folks who basically contribute to the DSpace development but are not paid by DSpace. And then there are folks like us who want features, and we have local developers, and we either develop something and contribute it back, or we pay a service provider like For Science or Atmire or Library Code. They're more to create and develop a feature for us, and then that can get contributed back to the code base. So I think I just often felt like I'm going to be in this meeting and I'm going to be able to raise my hand and say, we really need this. And then other people would say, yes, +1, we need it too. And then it was going to become a part of the development plan. And that's just not quite how it works. It really is so community driven. It is what the community pays for and the community can develop on their own. And that has taken a long time, probably still not quite perfect in that understanding, but that's where I'm at today. So thanks.
Thanks, Erica, for sure. Colin, did you want to add your own?
Yeah, I'll just build on that a little bit, just especially if people are kind of looking like, where do I fit? What do I do? Wait, maybe my institution doesn't have resources. I saw that in the question set. What are things that, whether it's time or resources. And I think what the beautiful thing about this, particularly in specifically the DSpace community, is that there is this DCAD group. And so what it does is it allows folks kind of a really easy landing point to get involved. So I would, recommend folks, look at these working groups. It's an easy way to get started. They're typically curated by co-chairs. There's usually a pretty solid, work plan, and initiative. They're easy to sell to your supervisor because they're already shovel ready. That's often a consideration. You go into like an open source community and it's like, I want to contribute, but I can't sell any of this stuff to anybody to donate my time. So working groups have that kind of structure that's really helpful. And then, they're really kind. It's people who all have a common goal and are looking to achieve something. And so, they're wonderful groups. And so that's my advice.
Thanks, Colin. I appreciate your point about making things easy to sell to supervisors. It's always useful to have an angle. Mark, did you want to wrap up this section? Thank you.
I just want to add that I agree with everything everybody has said, but I also want to add that when you are, say, working on one of the working groups that Colin described, and DCAT is a good example, you have to keep in mind, or you should keep in mind, just to kind of stay centered, that all the people you're working with, you do not typically share a single employer. Like all the paychecks in the room are not being paid by one institution. You need something else to keep that relationship going. And if you can't do that through a common desire to improve the software and the community, then you're probably in the wrong meeting. Like, you need to have that. There's no other real motivator, right? And I think that is something you can sell your boss, right? That you are there not just to warm a seat, but you're there to help move forward the shared enterprise, which is the community and the software. That's all.